Hello and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Jez, and I'm thrilled that you're joining us today for another fun-filled episode where we sprinkle a little magic over the world of business and leadership. Each week, we dive into fascinating topics that inspire and educate, all while keeping things lighthearted and enjoyable. Magical Learning has been running successfully as a training and facilitation company for over 20 years and has partnered with global thought leaders like Robin Sharma and John Mattone. So whether you're a seasoned leader, a budding entrepreneur, or just curious about how to make learning magical, there's something here for you. So grab your favorite drink, grab a snack, and sit back because it's time for some magical learning. And it's not just me today. And I think if you've tuned into the Magical Learning podcast recently, you'll notice that I'm on Zoom today, which is because we've gone to our emergency systems here, but it's all in service of a great conversation here. Because today I'm lucky enough to be joined by Vanessa Roanhorse. So Vanessa, before we get into anything, how's your week going?
Thank you so much. Well, it's Monday, and I think it's going to be good, but hard to say right now in the US.
Yes, yes, and that's right. Our listeners may have picked up that you have a US accent. You're over there at the moment. So I guess, Vanessa, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself for listeners that may be being introduced to you for the first time?
Sure thing. It's so good to be here, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Vanessa Roanhorse. I am Dana, a Navajo Nation citizen in the United States, and I currently live in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, on Tiwa lands.
Fantastic. And Vanessa, we've got you on today because I read one of your articles recently and I thought it was just absolutely mind-blowing. And I thought the way that you'd just written it was just so fantastic. And the link to that is going to be available in the description. But the article is called Radical Economics, Centering Indigenous Knowledge, Restoring the Circle. Now, we have a lot of questions to get through and not a lot of time. So before we get into those questions, though, did you want to say anything about that article at all?
Yeah, sure thing. I just want to say that that article is really just kind of our first attempt to try to articulate this sort of worldview that we're trying to present as another way for us to actually think about capital, capital flow, and resources, which is really critical. And part of that has a lot to do with us bringing Indigenous femme energy and just femme energy back into the circles of leadership and decision making over resources. And this is one, I hope, of like a foundation, which I'm currently working on writing now.
Mm. Well, fantastic. And I mean, it's an amazing article. I hope people, before they jump into these questions, go have a quick read. It's not super long, so you can have a
Mhm.
little cup of coffee and get through it. So I highly recommend doing that first. But I think let's jump right into the questions here because we've got so many to get to. And the team was really excited by this. We've got some really good questions. So I might start in well, with our Director of Learning's question from Danette, which is, tell us more about the first principle of Indigenous worldviews and then I'll get to part two later. So let's maybe start there. Tell us more about the first principle of Indigenous worldviews.
Sure. So the seven principles of Indigenous worldviews really came from a renowned Mississauga Anishinaabe woman who is also a scholar. Her name is Leanne Simpson. And one thing she says is these principles aren't new, they're collective wisdom from like generational learning. So it's this idea that we currently here in the US live in a Western worldview, which came from Europe, which was brought over and through colonization, particularly settler colonialism, the worldview we have is very singular, individual, sort of, you know, winner takes all at whatever means. And what we're presenting with these concepts is that um, a, an indigenous worldview, we've all got so many worldviews and unfortunately, due to the way the world is, we have lost them. And so by returning to our worldview, which just acknowledges that information is holistic and dependent and cyclical, and it's relying upon our kinship and relationships to one another, to the world around us, and really to the holy people, which really is like this idea that we aren't the center of the universe.
Mm. Yes, I mean, I'm sure people would have listened to that and already seen that there's a lot of wisdom just in that alone. And there's just so, like that. This is the exciting thing about the article is that it blends what I would call a lot of wisdom with a lot of sort of even sort of attaching it to modern thinking and giving us new ways of thinking. Really, when I was reading the article, just to step away from the questions just quickly, was how much I saw what has to be the future in looking at the
Hmm.
past, and just
Hmm.
the way that you'd laid things out. Because when I look at how we live now, it's so unsustainable. Yet we have
Hmm.
people who've lived on the land for hundreds of years, maintained it, knew how to be sustainable with it, and those answers are still sitting there. They haven't changed. The places, you know. So I just think that there's so much to take out of this article and this conversation as well. But yes, there's just so many interesting elements to that.
Well, I mean, to your point, like one of the things I think is just fascinating as we sort of bridge this moment, is that globally Indigenous people make up 5% of the population, but are actually still stewarding over 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And so, as we hold that very big thing, one of the pieces that this article explores, but also I'm curious about, is what would the world look like if Indigenous people were actually stewarding 80% of the world's capital?
Mm.
Because so much of this idea of sustainability is driven by capitalism.
Yes, very fascinating thoughts, and I do want to get into more of a conversation, but there's so many
Sure.
questions we've got to get to. So, but these insights are fantastic, Vanessa. So thank you so much for this. All right, let's jump into part two of Jeanette's question here. I would love to hear more about your relationship model of developing and the impacts it is having.
Well, I mean, really, we're exploring this idea of like who gets to have decision making over resource flow. So that's one. And then the other is these vehicles and models over capital flow, like the way money moves, they're really new. Like our current economy in the United States is less than 100 years old. And so this idea that we can actually reimagine using the existing tools and vehicles in front of us to get us to the next world we're trying to get to, I think is where we're at, and is the possibility and potentiality of what we're trying to build with our work at Roanhorse Consulting. Because alternative approaches to structuring and accessing capital is possible if we actually build with the people we're trying to do this for. And we understand that these sort of top down, off the shelf solutions don't work for a reason because it doesn't acknowledge culture, community, place, and spirituality. And
Mm.
so it's hard to talk about money this way because that is not the way we have been taught finances work. It has been so separated from our lives. And it's also been complicated um, and overly complex so that we think we don't understand money.
Absolutely fascinating. And you know, Vanessa, one thing that you do that I absolutely love when I see people do is people that really live what they believe. Like we can't all do huge changes and change the whole system overnight, but I do believe that people that live through their values, are doing at least a huge part of that by showing people what is and what isn't possible. So I think that's amazing what you're doing, with Roanhorse Consulting as well there. So, and we'll get into that a little bit towards the end as well, where people can reach out to you and find out a bit about that. But yeah, I'm just going to jump into Graham's question here, which is, what approach, question, or position have you found the most effective when confronted with the inevitable "so what" reaction? And then he's put in brackets, probably from older white men, to the knowledge you're sharing.
The so what happens all the time. So my sort of general response is if what you're saying is more real than what I'm saying, then help me understand how we're going to have 3 generations ahead of us have a good life. Like, help me understand how my work can ensure that's going to happen. And I think oftentimes, because current modern thinking and the way capitalism works is really short sighted. So there isn't generational thinking in it. What's happening is people are thinking in this next year, 7 years when I get a return on an investment, where the market is at, this questionable market. Um, that's what they're thinking of. And so for me, I often respond from a place of like, well, if you are correct, I would like to be able to support and drive towards that. You just have to tell me how we do that. And oftentimes there isn't a real answer because they can't fathom beyond the current return on their investments.
Mm. Absolutely. Well, Vanessa, I think that that is a that's again great insights and great wisdom here. I'm so happy we've got you on the podcast. All right, well, let's jump into Alan's question here, which is my question is in relation to the seven principles of Indigenous worldviews. And again, to check those out, you can go have a look at the article. Could Vanessa tell us about these worldviews, particularly number seven? Human beings are the least important in the world.
Well, I sort of touched upon it in the beginning because I think in the way we think about success and money and happiness, unfortunately, it centers on ourselves as an individual, which means that in order for us to achieve those things, someone won't have those things. And so, this sort of very binary way in which that worldview exists, the seventh principle of Indigenous worldview says, seventh, human beings are the least important in the world. And that's because when we decenter ourselves, we're actually willing to acknowledge that we are actually just part of of a bigger system, like a bigger ecosystem. To use scientific words, like we actually play a piece in this, but we aren't the reason. However, through our way of being and thinking, we actually have an opportunity to steward and make active choices to caretake. And for that is the hardest, I think, in a capitalistic colonial mindset, is to actually imagine what it would look like if you didn't put yourself first and you actually put the animals in your backyard first, the plants in your neighbor's yard first. And so that's really the purpose of that. And particularly when talking about money, this is the one that is the hardest paradigm to shift.
So fascinating. Well, I think this actually leads really nicely into my question. And this is like I've been doing a little bit of study on economics, and there's just so many things that confuse me. And I think a lot of what you say makes a lot more sense in sort of my understanding. But I wanted to get your thoughts on this. When we see people who have so much but continue to work despite having enough to retire on 100 times over, how do you look at them and what they are missing about the human experience? I thought of this because of Hilton's indigenomics ideas, and number five being measuring wealth through relationships and community across time.
I can't even fathom what that's like to have that kind of money. So it's hard to understand the mindset.
Mm.
And then, reading recent writings around sort of billionaire and this concept of folks like an Elon Musk or folks like a Jeff Bezos, and they're realizing that that also is another form of trauma of money. Like there is something about the way we have structured capital that creates trauma. It's either the money's been weaponized against you to keep you where you are and to harm you, which is definitely what happened here in the United States, when our land was stolen and we were nearly annihilated and forced to live on these reservations. And for many communities, not even near where their people were from. And then to have this other class of so much extreme wealth, they're experiencing a different form of trauma money. And if anything, what it causes them to become is the people who are in fear of losing that money to the point where they weaponize it again. So it's this crazy cycle that we're in. And so when I think about it, it's hard for me to understand it
Mm.
because I live in the real world. And for me, I'm not measuring my wealth through fear. I'm thinking a lot differently, which is how does this money help others and make the people in my life healthier, happier, safer? So that idea of measuring wealth through relationships and community across time, that is inherently an Indigenous way of thinking and being. But I also think inherently it's how we as a people have created kinship and culture. We've just lost it.
Mm. Yes, I definitely agree. And yes, great insights there again. All right, well let's go to Kanika's question here, which is one that we've touched on a few times here in sort of a roundabout way, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this, which is how can we get society back to multi-generational thinking, and then in brackets 7 generations ahead?
I'm Navajo, so our teachings tell us that every day you have to wake up and present yourself to the holy people, and with intention, you set your goals. And every day, you're not going to achieve every single one. But that's why We've been given the gift of waking up early every morning to do the same thing. So I think how we get back to multi-generational thinking is that people as a collective whole have to be intentional with where it is they're trying to go. And in this moment, with money being the primary tool for safety and freedom and success, we have to put our money intentionally where it needs to be, where it will achieve safety and liberation for folks. That is a collective we can actually do as society. And when I think about 7 generations ahead, I acknowledge, and that my team acknowledges, the work we're doing today is just one small piece. We will not see the future we're building towards, but that's my job. It is not to ask to celebrate that we have changed the way these things are. It is that I understand my moment in time and I am intentionally deciding where I put my resources. And I think that's something everyone can do. And it's happening, in a lot of different capacities. But that's how we get back towards the 7 generations ahead. We have to decenter ourselves. We have to be doing things today, thinking about our great grandchildren ahead. And third, with the tool of the moment, which is money, we have to use that money to get towards where we're trying to go.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. And I hope everybody can start to feel a bit confused, hopefully have some insights there on how to begin that journey. We've got just 2 questions here left. We're really doing perfectly well for the time. So this is fantastic. I'm going to throw over to John's question now. And it's a bit of a longer one. The Western white wave economy has been, as you describe, growth without cost mindset. We, political parties, United Nations, and large organizations tell us that to survive, we must grow. But at what cost? We have island nations being lost to sea, wildfires in the middle of American winter, and some unprecedented weather conditions here in Australia. Industrialization has had a cost, and it's on the earth. I'd like to know more about the concept of reframing economics and work to breathe life back into the old ways.
The industrialism was definitely the tinder that lit the the fire. That was like the foundation. And now as we move into this new technological age, because industrialism is done, now we're into this new age of technology, which will take that fire and turn it into an explosion. And so, from my point of view, economics as a concept and as a practice, it experiences the world linearly. There's a beginning, there's an end. There's a starting point, and then there's some future end date to these things. But it's on this linear continuum. But if you think about it, these are just cycles. So economies are just cycles of where things move. And when I think about the reframing of economics, I want to come back to this idea that like it isn't a linear, and I'm not the first person that's ever thought this. There are many great writers who have thought this, but it's the idea that we actually have the potentiality to take the existing resources, which are finite, because part of what capitalism has done is told us that there is infinite scale. That is absolutely not true.
Mm.
But we look at the finiteness of the current resources and we use them wisely. We return them back. We stop buying so cheaply. We stop demanding things so cheaply. But that can only happen if we're willing to pay people what they deserve to have not a living wage, but a thriving wage. And so, particularly here in the United States, where we have forced the world to give us products and tools at the lowest cost possible, so our community members can barely afford these like seemingly luxe items, when the reality of it is it's all garbage and we know where the garbage is ending. And so the reframing of economics is actually looking at the things we have in front of us and then knowing that it had to come from somewhere, and knowing as a result of that that resource is now gone.
Mm.
And so that is where we are being forced, right? Like we are actually being forced into acknowledging a more circular, regenerative economic framework. Because if we don't, the earth is going to do what the earth's going to do, and it'll take care of itself.
Mm.
And so, from my point of view, I'm like, we either want to still be on this world, or the earth's just going to take us back.
Mm.
And it's going to keep doing its cycles, whether we're here or not.
Mhm.
And that for me is the most important part about reframing economics is that this is not a singular, lonely, linear journey
Mm.
at all.
What a good way to look at it, Vanessa. And I think that leads us very nicely into our final question here from Allegra, which is when we think about the future and how society could function, what ideas and structures from the past would you employ first if you were put in charge? Cue laughter.
Sorry. I mean, obviously because I'm United States based,
Mhm.
we would get rid of billionaires, period.
Mm,
Like we would completely cap them, tax them, and move that money and get it back into circulation. Because that's half the problem is this money is not in circulation.
mm,
I mean, honestly, I don't even know. Like having that is even a post question as much as I love it. There's a part of me that's like, that's not my job.
mm,
My job is to play the part I'm currently playing, which is imagining, testing, iterating, and piloting new ways to flow capital through the current existing vehicles we have, and then working with aligned investors, partners, philanthropy, businesses to to grow it. Because I'm interested in working in that interstitial space. If and when we're hopefully successful, I imagine someone way smarter, way,
mm,
way more creative is going to help us figure out how to put these new tools into place.
mm.
So it's hard. It's a really tough question. And I honestly, and I wish I had a much more clear answer on what that would look like. But I know the only thing I can say for sure is we no longer have billionaire status.
Mm. Well, I mean, Vanessa, I think even throughout this whole podcast, I mean, now that we've got to the end of the questions and sort of my final thoughts, it's so I think even just have leading with that idea of how can we be aware of what we're doing for future generations and just having that as a core principle that we make decisions from is already a great sort of guiding North Star in a way. But today's been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you so much for taking the time. Did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to leave our audience with, just sort of in relation to this conversation, or in regard to your article, "Radical Economics: Centering Indigenous Knowledge and Restoring the Circle"?
There are so many incredible people and organizations that are having this conversation and doing this work. And I encourage everyone to really do some searching around restorative economics, regenerative economics, indigenous economics. Um, some of them call them donut economics, but that there is more than enough thought work in this to get everybody started that connects to you, your worldview, and like who you are culturally. Because the moment we can change a framework around how this is supposed to work is how we get started. And so like that's my biggest encouragement is to do that because I'm just one of many. And I really do believe this is a movement. It's a movement towards sustainability, but really rebuilding our relationship with Mother Earth, which is why what I'm working on is repatriating economies.
Mm. Well, again, thank you so much for that and great insights. Now, if people have listened to this and they want to reach out to you, to contact you for to do some work, where's the best place for them to do that? And do you want to tell us just a little bit about Roanhorse Consulting as well?
Sure thing. You're welcome to reach out to us through our Instagram and LinkedIn accounts. The company's name is Roanhorse Consulting. We're a for-profit social enterprise that's Indigenous owned and led by myself and my twin sister. And we focus particularly on using our Indigenous methodologies and ways of being to do evaluation and research and working with partners to reimagine how they're flowing capital. So and you can see us on our website, www.roamhorseconsulting.com.
Fantastic. Well, all those links will be in the description if you want to check that out. Vanessa, I want to thank you so much. I think, this whole journey for me started with the sort of core of economics being around scarcity and that concept of scarcity. And when I read what your article was talking about, it just really made me realize how much we can be surrounded by abundance. And all your wisdom today has also really shared a good light on that and really great lens for people to check things out through. So thank you very much for that. I just want to say to all our listeners, thank you so much. Our numbers have been growing really nicely on YouTube, so thank you. Please keep following and watching on there. And as always, everybody, have a magical week.